FFPC and NFFC playoff contest today, kind of how I see them, how they're set up, and different ways to get leverage to attack these contests. It's always my favorite each year. Grind DFS all season, and then you get these different unique contests. They're a bit softer. The goals are a bit different. You get to sweat them over the entire course of the playoffs. It's definitely a nice change up and something I always look forward to. And drop in the comments if you have any other playoff contests you like to play. It's definitely one of my favorite things to do. This is not Establish a Million, like it says, our flagship GPP show over on Establish the Run, but we're treating this like a GPP, so have the Establish a Million background. Let's start with FFPC. First off, if you're playing in the FFPC, definitely make sure you check out Jeff Miller's article on Establish the Run. He breaks down the strategy, kind of the whole thing. But yeah, we'll go over very quick primer in case anyone here isn't familiar with the game. It's one of those games that is extremely simple on the surface, but actually quite complex. Simple on the surface because you're taking maximum one player per team, so not a ton of choices. Here's your starting lineup requirements: 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 4 flex spots, 1 DST, 1 kicker. With 14 teams in the playoffs, that means you will have 2 teams that you do not select a player from. Some FFPC scoring wrinkles. They do tight end premium, which means you're going to get 1.5 points per reception for tight ends. Only 1 point per reception for all other players. I really like that for the playoff contest because it actually brings tight ends into play into the flex spots and makes them a little bit more important. Quarterback scoring is also a little bit more favorable for pocket passers. 4-point passing touchdown, but 1 point per 20 yards passing instead of 25. The other thing to note is the payout structure in this contest, really top heavy. Whether you're playing the $35 or the $200, very top heavy. So you're playing this to win. Obviously, it's nice to get some cash back, but you're playing to get first. You're not playing to min cash in this type of contest, or don't even bother. And that doesn't mean you have to get insanely crazy, which we're going to go over, but you do have to be cognizant of getting to the top, and really, you don't want to have a lineup that dupes another person's lineup. And it seems like that's hard to do. But when you start to look at all the combinations, it's surprisingly pretty easy to get a unique lineup, especially in the 235, might be a little bit tougher. Going over why I think it's more complex than it seems. If I gave you the exact playoff bracket, how it plays out, I think a lot of people would say, I know exactly the team, what's going to be optimal and whatnot. But it's actually not that simple. If Baltimore plays San Francisco in the Super Bowl, and the conference championship game was Baltimore versus the Bills, you might think, okay, this is pretty obviously going to be a Lamar Jackson team. Lamar Jackson's going to be the highest scoring quarterback. If he goes to the Super Bowl, it's worth double points. That's the other wrinkle. Super Bowl's worth 2 times as many points as the other round. So there's a little bit of added variance there. But you have to look at not only how much does Lamar Jackson outscore all the other quarterbacks, what's the gap between Lamar Jackson and his teammates? Compare that between, the gap between Lamar and Josh Allen, and the gap between Josh Allen and his teammates. And then also the gap between Stephon Diggs and Josh Allen, and the gap between Stephon Diggs and the other wide receivers. So it's actually kind of confusing to figure out what's optimal, even if you knew all the scores. It's really tricky to figure out the best ball scoring sort of. It's not best ball, of course, but just the way that works out. So I hope that makes sense. I know it's a little bit confusing to say because it is a little bit confusing to figure out by hand. I could give you all the scores of the players, and I don't think you would intuitively be able to say which lineup is optimal. It might take you a little bit of work and some mathing to figure that out, which is why this contest is so interesting. But some table stakes stuff to consider. You don't want to have a conflicting bracket outcome. And what I mean by that is you probably, again, you're going to have 4 teams where you really kind of fade the team. You're either taking a kicker or defense, or you're not taking anyone. You don't want those to be in the same game, even if it's an ugly game. You think Houston, Cleveland's ugly. You don't really want anyone in that game. maybe you don't take anyone on Houston, you take the Cleveland defense. Could that win? Yes, but you're threading a pretty fine needle because someone's going to have a skill player on one of those two teams that's getting points in round 1 and round 2, and the defenses and kickers just don't score a ton. I've seen teams survive with getting that wrong, but I don't think it's something you want to plan on from the get-go. It's a backdoor out. It could definitely happen. The Cleveland defense dominates, and then their offense doesn't really do too much, even in round 2, and they lose in round 2, and it gets there. I've had years where kicker came to round 2 and almost survived it, but you don't want to start assuming that. That's kind of like you hope to get lucky if it breaks where you take a kicker or defense on a team that advances, but you're really hoping that team loses in round 1. So that's where the table stakes thing is considered no conflicting bracket. So how do we gain leverage in this contest? There's a few different ways. One, you do not want to be overconfident in who wins and loses games. Even the Steelers this weekend have, off the top of my head, like a 15 to 20% chance of winning this game against the Bills. I don't think you want to go crazy, picking tons of upsets and everything, but the bracket is going to inform, the rest of your roster. Which players do well if a team wins versus if a team loses. How many points are they accumulating? Like if you're fading Lamar Jackson, that is a lot easier if they lose in either round 2 or round 3 and they don't make it to the Super Bowl. So you might want to think through, okay, I don't want to play Lamar Jackson. What happens if I don't play Lamar Jackson? Well, Baltimore loses in divisional round or conference championship. Which teams make it to the Super Bowl? How does that impact who I'm playing at quarterback instead of Lamar Jackson? So thinking through the bracket and not having overconfidence in the favorites is something that's important. We see upsets all the time. I remember the one year Michael Thomas was like 90% owned and they lost round 1 as huge favorites, I think to Minnesota, although I'm not positive. So that was, illuminating. There's also overconfidence in player outcomes. That same year, I think all the mega chalk failed. I think Lamar was one and done that year, and he was mega chalk. I think George Kittle was mega chalk, and I believe San Francisco made a run, and he just didn't do anything. I think that was the year like Raheem Mostert and somebody else were like, split. Tevin Coleman had different 4 touchdown games. So don't have overconfidence in player outcomes either. There's going to be some chalk you want to eat, but there's also going to be some situations where they just due to roster construction or the way people, think through things, they might have too much of, Amon-Ra St. Brown over Jahmyr Gibbs when, the player outcomes are like kind of close between those two guys. And there's a lot of variance, especially if they go 1 and done or 2 and done. There's always going to be a little bit more variance on teams that go 1 and done, opening up a little bit more avenues for you to get leverage. And speaking of those 1 and done situations, some small pivots could block out your opponents for the rest of the tournament. Some of this scoring ends up fixed where like, if, for example, I fade Miami, it's a cold weather game and everyone's playing Tyreek Hill. And I just say, I'm not going to play anyone from Miami. Instead, I'm going to play Mike Evans from Tampa Bay when a lot of people might just soft fade Tampa Bay, either kicker defense or not play them at all. And Mike Evans outscores Tyreek Hill by, 6 points. And then the Miami defense scores about even with the Tampa Bay defense. I've picked up 6 points. It doesn't sound like a lot, but these small wins can be huge when it starts to get concentrated as players get eliminated, and it reduces the amount of ways your opponents can make up ground. So, obviously you're taking on a risk there, but if a lot more people have Tyreek Hill, you could pass a lot of lineups, block out a lot of lineups by just winning a little bit. So there's going to be other situations where we talk about where you can gain a lot of points on the field, which is obviously ideal. If you play DFS, we talk about that. Like you want big wins, not small wins. But the small wins in the FFPC, because the way the contest is constructed, is actually pretty important, especially if you have an otherwise pretty chalky lineup. Like if you have a pretty chalky lineup, you 2v2 pivot, that might be huge. You're taking on a big risk, but again, very top-heavy contest. we want to try to win it. The other thing I wanted to hit on, it is okay to middle a little bit. I'm usually team never middle, but in choosing a bracket, I do think there's some outcomes where there's some optionality in the bracket where you don't need it to go 100% your way and you can still be right. So finding those situations and what those player combinations look like is big, where there's some, if you're playing, a Buffalo defense and Najee Harris for Pittsburgh, very galaxy brain off the wall, you 100% need Pittsburgh to win that game, or else you're dead. You're absolutely drawing dead. Now, if you play Najee Harris and a Buffalo skill player, you have some optionality there where if Pittsburgh wins, it's a huge win for you. Even if your Buffalo piece flops, so many people are going to have a Buffalo piece that flopped. Almost no one's going to have Najee Harris or whoever the Pittsburgh piece is. So there's some optionality there where Pittsburgh could lose and Najee Harris, scores 2 goal line touchdowns. But if they win, you're in an amazing spot. And even deeper into the bracket too, thinking through if there's some quarterbacks that can get there in 2 and 3 games. We saw it with Josh Allen a few years ago. So if you play I'm going to play Josh Allen over Lamar Jackson, you might be able to have that work out without the Bills going to the Super Bowl. You want them to, but there's some outs. So thinking through some optionality in the brackets is important. Jack Miller's article I referenced, it's definitely a good one to check out. These are projections, which I'll go to in a second. But in his article, he identifies kind of like the optimal or chalk player way people are going to play for each team. So let's start looking at some specific spots. But the 2 players I think are going to be the highest owned in this contest. And if you want full ownership projections, go over to Legendary Upside. Here's just an example of what you'll get from Pat Crane, ownership projections for the whole team, for each of the team. I hope Pat's okay with me showing his Baltimore ownership projections, but I find that really useful. So Legendary Upside, Pat Crane does a tremendous job with that. We don't have ownership projections on ETR, but we do have, again, kind of carved out who we think most people are going to play. And I want to dovetail this from when I talk about ways to gain leverage. You don't have to go full galaxy brain. You can go leverage with some legitimately really good players. I think sometimes people will play too chalky in 11 out of 12 spots, and then they'll go, they'll play Josh Reynolds as their Detroit piece to get, no one's going to play Josh Reynolds. And you're seeding so many projected points and you're only giving yourself 1 out. I don't think that's the smart way to play the contest, which is super chalky 90% of the way and 1 extreme pivot. I'd rather make 3 or 4 pivots that actually don't give up as much in projection as you think. 2 spots where I do have a tougher time getting away from the chalk would be CMC and CeeDee Lamb early on. And if you look at our playoff projections, I think one of the best ways to look at this when you're evaluating whether a player is good is don't worry about the overall FFPC points based on our expected games. You're going to look at a bracket and figure out how the bracket goes. You want to look at the points per game stuff. And you see CMC is 3 points ahead of his quarterback. Almost every other team, the quarterback is tops on their team. And he's about 10 points above any of the other skill players between Debo, Kittle, and Ayuk. So that's a big gap. The other thing that's crazy is this year, usually we get a lot of people playing a lot of running backs, maybe too much. A lot of teams are going to have 2, maybe 3 running backs on their roster, and that's it. And you have to start 2. So positional scarcity is a very real thing. Some years it's not. It's just kind of straight up versus your teammate. And then it's okay, well, I could see Debo outscoring CMC. Not the craziest thing in the world. I'll take a low-owned shot at that. You start to run into scenarios with CMC where Debo outscores CMC by a little bit, and you still don't need you still need CMC because of the running back position. We've got him projected 6 points higher than any other running back. So I think that's a thing with CMC is you need a teammate to outscore him. You need the positional scarcity stuff to break right. And again, we're talking about big wins versus small wins. There's some little things I like to block out opponents early to get small wins, but a situation where everyone's playing a San Francisco skill player, I don't know if that huge risk you're taking on with fading CMC is worth it to maybe get Debo outscoring him by like 7. There's ways it works for sure. There's a way anything works. We just want the odds of it working against the impact it has on our standings, when it does work versus when it doesn't. So tough time fading CMC. The other player, tough time fading is CeeDee Lamb, just because, again, another situation where he's really close to his quarterback. So, it's tough. And I like to think through what happens if the team wins or loses and what that does to things. And what's tough with CeeDee Lamb is if they lose, they're throwing the ball and he's going to have a lot of targets and probably be your optimal Dallas play. If they win and you play, let's say, Tony Pollard over him, well, it's tough for Pollard to beat Lamb over multiple games. So you get into a situation where you don't really want the running back as a pivot off a wide receiver in a loss, which, I could see playing a loss. I don't think that's the worst thing in the world, but like, it's not the best setup for Pollard. And then if you play them to win, now you need Pollard to outscore Lamb over multiple games, and that becomes more and more unlikely. So those are things I like to think through. If I were to fade CeeDee, I'd almost rather do like Jake Ferguson at tight end with the tight end premium scoring. I'd like, and again, I'll think through that optionality where maybe I'll pair that with a Green Bay skill player and we get a chance that Ferguson racks up some catches, scores a touchdown and a loss, and Green Bay wins. I'm not totally dead if Dallas wins, but I'm hoping they lose because I'm more likely to gain stuff on the field with Ferguson over CeeDee if Green Bay wins that game. So those are different ways I like to think about it and why I would take Ferguson as a pivot instead of Tony Pollard as a pivot over CeeDee Lamb, but ultimately really like the CeeDee Lamb chalk. Going through the other players that Jack identified as chalky, Amon-Ra for Detroit. Tampa Bay could be Mike Evans or, fade, soft fade. Philly could be A.J. Brown, but that injury stuff's up in the air. So that's going to be one that I watch where people might just be afraid of this situation. Kyren Williams for the Rams. Green Bay, people are going to mostly fade or soft fade because they're such big underdogs. They're another one where we're keeping an eye on injury stuff. Almost hope Christian Watson's out and it condenses. And I don't think it would change ownership much, but it'd make it easier to play like Jaden Reed or someone in one of your flex spots. Lamar for Baltimore for sure. Buffalo, probably close between Diggs and Allen, but ultimately think Lamar is just going to carry more ownership than Allen, just because I think Diggs is an easier click than like Zay Flowers is for Baltimore. Kelsey with the tight end premium scoring, despite how poorly he's done, is on there. Houston, fade or soft fade. Cleveland, we've got Amari. He's just been phenomenal. Maybe Njoku. I think those two might be close. Miami for sure, Tyreek Hill. Pittsburgh, fade, soft fade. So those are sort of the optimal. Jack also is giving kind of his idea on who you would take if you wanted leverage from the team. Some of my favorite spots are fading Kyren Williams, where I think, again, the positional scarcity at running back is going to force a lot of people to just go CMC Kyren and call it a day. But really, this is an underdog against a good run defense. And we've got in our projections pretty tight between Puka, Kupp, and Kyren. Actually have Kyren, slightly behind in the full PPR scoring his teammates, Kupp and Puka. Now the positional scarcity is a favor towards Kyren, but I think Kupp in particular is a really good play if he comes in less than Puka. And I think too, sometimes what you see the field do is they will jump to either the next obvious pivot or they'll go full Gale brain. So that means if I'm going to fade Kyren, I'll play Puka, or I'll go full Galaxy brain on Alec. Sometimes they don't go, if I'm going to fade Kyren, I'll play, I won't play Puka because Kupp's close enough and he'll be lower owned. Sometimes the field doesn't do that, and that third guy ends up being really critical. So I like Cooper Kupp there. And then that necessitates too that somewhere else you're taking a running back and fading a wide receiver because you have to fill that second running back spot. So Jahmyr Gibbs over Amon-Ra makes sense. I think those guys too, again, probably closer than the field thinks. If we look at our projection, Amon-Ra and Kyren versus Gibbs and Kupp, you're only giving up about 3 points in projection. It's a decent bit, but in a contest like this, but especially when you think through the way things happen too, right? Like a Detroit win and a Rams loss, the projections, if you knew those were the scenarios, that combo would be a little bit tighter. I still think Amon-Ra Kyren would project ahead, but it'd be closer with Gibbs and Kupp. So the Kyren fade with a Rams wide receiver forces you to also do Pacheco over Kelsey or Gibbs over Amon-Ra, different things like that. Or, I think Miami in this cold weather game, I think fading Tyreek Hill, if you play Miami to lose, there's definitely some routes where Tyreek Hill just has a pedestrian game and you're better off taking the Miami defense, or even if they do a real run heavy approach, like they could have a run heavy approach and a loss in this type of weather. And maybe that's Mostert or Achane. And while you do want to think through how a team wins or loses, there are circumstances where the order of operations is weird. For example, the Chargers last year blew a huge lead and lost that game. So if you were playing Jacksonville to win last year, you might have said, give me Travis Etienne. But because of the way they won, they came from behind. You wanted Christian Kirk or Evan Ingram. So again, a lot of this stuff's nuanced. You want to think about who's going to win or lose, but you also don't want to go overboard and realize there's a lot of different ways a game can outcome. As someone asked about the expected games, it does. We're baking that in our FFPC projections for 2x for the Super Bowl. So that's why they look high. I think San Francisco's at like 2.9 or something, but that's because we're giving them their Super Bowl games that we're expecting specifically. We're giving them 2x, and San Francisco's market odds to go to the Super Bowl right now, I honestly think they're inflated. They're insane. It's like maybe 55% if you just went by the futures market, which isn't perfect because they might juice up the top favorites a little bit more. When we get to NFFC, you'll see our expected games over there is lower because we are not 2xing the Super Bowl. Speaking of, so I think I covered most of what I want to cover with FFPC. Feel free to throw any questions in the chat. I'm going to jump to NFFC, but if I see something that's worth covering, I'll go back over. But I think that's it. I guess if I was going to give some like galaxy brain takes, I think Philly could just get overlooked here. The game's on Monday night. There's uncertain injury situation between Hurts's finger and AJ Brown's knee issue. And if people avoid that, I still think this Philly team could make a run. That's a little bit of an IKB. The market odds aren't great, but I think that's interesting. I also think, Hurts is the type of quarterback that could get there in 2 or 3 games. If he gets a lot of rushing touchdowns, really see him pull away from his teammates a ton. And then San Francisco goes to the Super Bowl and it's CMC over Purdy anyways. And then, depending what happens in the AFC, if you get a non-Buffalo Baltimore team in the Super Bowl, quarterback gets really trippy. That might be asking for a lot, but San Francisco Super Bowl versus not Buffalo or Baltimore isn't, the craziest thing in the world. And then, that opens the door for Jalen Hurts or something. So let's go over to NFFC. Same thing. We've got our NFFC playoff projections. Scoring system over there, a little bit different. It is not tight end premium. So it's regular PPR for everybody. For passing, it is 1 point per 20 yards like FFPC, but also 6 points per passing touchdown. So quarterbacks can score a ton over there. As far as the structure, if I go to, I've got 3 teams registered right now for it. It's a little bit different. You're starting 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, then 4 wide receiver or tight end, 1 flex, a kicker, and a defense. So still 12 players overall, but it's a huge difference in starting that second quarterback The other huge difference, not huge, this game is completely different than FFPC, but you can add players through each of the rounds. So round one, you have a maximum of one player per team. So it starts out similar to FFPC, but each subsequent round, you can add one more player per team. So if you think Baltimore goes to Super Bowl, you start with Lamar Jackson, round one. Round two, you can add another Baltimore player. Round three, you could add a third Baltimore player. They go to the Super Bowl. Round four, you could add a fourth. On top of that, the longer a player is on your roster, they accumulate more points. So if you start with Lamar Jackson, he gets his normal points round one, which would be 0 because he's got a bye. But round two, already, he's going to get double points. Round three, triple points. Round four, quadruple points. Whereas if you were to add Lamar Jackson in the Super Bowl, he would only get 1 times points. So it's a very trippy game. It's a fun game because you kind of have to map things out. The bracket definitely becomes really important. And your goal is to basically in the Super Bowl have 1 through 4x on each side of it. So if it's Baltimore versus San Fran, you want something like Lamar 4x, Zay Flowers 3x, Gus Edwards 2x, and Justin Tucker. On the San Francisco side, you want CMC 4x, maybe Purdy 3x, Debo 2x, and Killer Ayuk 1x, that sort of thing. And I'm going to show you a spreadsheet I have to help map that out. But there's definitely a lot of wrinkles as a result of that I want to try and get through. One is, I talked about those small pivots early, like a Najee type thing instead of Tyreek Hill on FFPC, where like maybe gaining 6 points there goes a long way. On NFFC, it doesn't go a long way, and I'm less likely to kind of make one of those, wrinkles early because there's so much that happens in terms of the multipliers, and you also have opportunities later on as the weeks go to like gain leverage, get contrarian based on the standings and the ownership. I'm just less likely to like try and pick up 6 points early. On FFPC, you pick up those 6 points, it could legitimately freeze out teams that they mathematically cannot pass you after round one. NFFC, that can't happen because there's so much more still to go. So keep that in mind. The other thing is you do want to plan out the bracket for sure because you're trying to get 1 through 4x on both sides in the Super Bowl. But you can plan out brackets in ways that leave room for optionality again. And I think in the past, mistakes I've made is planning out the bracket too much like it has to go one way. Whereas like I could plan it out to go like a conference championship, I could make it so it doesn't matter who wins in the conference championship. If I get those 4 teams right, any order of the Super Bowl, I can maximize this. And I think, we talk about late swap and DFS a lot. You give yourself more outs. It's like kind of the Monte Carlo, like the 3-door or Monte Hall problem, the 3-door thing where, you're improving your odds, even though it might not seem like that. And as part of that too, I think sometimes what's confusing early is you'd think when you're filling out your roster, okay, just like FFPC, the teams that I want to lose, I'm going to throw in kicker and defense. Give me the skill players, get those out of there. The way the multiplier works and where you may want to be adding players, it might not be the worst thing in the world, depending on the bracket, to actually have the players on teams you think lose in the skill player spots. Like you might actually want to clear those spots up to be adding guys to teams you think could go deep into the contest. So sometimes I might do something like Amari Cooper and Nico Collins, knowing I'm going to clear up a wide receiver spot. And simultaneously, people aren't going to play a lot of Cleveland, Houston. So whichever side of that wins, I'm gaining leverage because hopefully they had a good game round one. And now I've got them 2x round two. So I've got a contrarian 2x round two player while clearing up a spot. Now it's going to force me to fade a player probably on a team that I think wins, which is a little scary. But let me show you kind of what I mean with that. So what I will do with NFFC is kind of map things out as to how it's going to go, how I'm going to add players. And I think like the simple thing is to say like, okay, you'd start round 1, you'd fill out your team, Lamar Jackson, blah, 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 times 1. You'd fill that all out times your whole roster. And then you'd go to week 2 and say, okay, who do I want to add week 2? You'd go, who do I want to add week 3 all the way to the Super Bowl? That's fine. I think it's better to actually work backwards. So I'll show you kind of a Baltimore Sam. I want to show you if we had a chalk bracket, Baltimore versus Buffalo in the NFC Championship game, or in the AFC Championship game, San Francisco versus Dallas in the NFC Championship game, chalk bracket, right? We work backwards. You can kind of see in week 3 what we want, which is, well, you look at like week 4 in the Super Bowl and kind of have the guys you want on the highest multipliers in the Super Bowl and work backwards from that. And here you start to see the optionality of things. So you could have Lamar and Allen both on a ×3 multiplier in week 3 if you started with them. You could have and that works going double AFC quarterback, because in the NFC, you've got 2 skill players in CeeDee Lamb and CMC that project so well relative to their quarterbacks. So you'd want those guys on ×3. So you kind of know you're starting with those players, right? So CMC, San Fran, ×1 to start. CD, Dallas, ×1 to start. Maybe I should have filled this whole thing out earlier, but I thought it would be interesting to go through the whole thing. Allen, Buffalo, ×1 to start. So we're backfilling week 1. We know what we want week 1 from these 4 teams. We know who we want to add week 2, right? So Diggs is definitely going to be like the best next Buffalo player. So week 2, we can carry this over week 2, the Lamar, Allen, CD stuff. They're going to be on ×2 multipliers in week 2 if this bracket goes the way we want. And then we know we're going to want to add Diggs. I usually highlight in yellow the players I want to add. Okay. We want to add Debo as our, let's say we want to add Debo for San Fran. He's the next best player. We're not going to turn on quarterback because we got double AFC and they're still alive. Tony Pollard's the next best Dallas player. We're going to want to add him in week 2 to get him to the ×3 in week 3. So we'll add Pollard, which leaves us with our Baltimore one, which again gets tricky, but it's probably going to be Zay Flowers. So you can see right off the bat, if we're maximizing towards the end, we need to clear up 4 skill player spots, and a lot of wide receiver spots, at least 1 running back spot. So you start to see how that works out. And you can see how I have this planned out. Then in week 3, who I would add, well, James Cook versus Gus Edwards is tough, and you might do this based on ownership. But right now I'm planning on adding James Cook week 3 for Buffalo, Ayuk week 3 for San Francisco, and then go kicker defense for Baltimore, Dallas. They don't have like an amazing third player. So like, I think you could survive with Dallas DST, Baltimore kicker in the Super Bowl on a ×2, and then adding someone. And you can see in the Super Bowl, regardless of who wins, we either have Lamar or Allen ×4. We're going to add Dak or Purdy ×1. We have CMC or CD ×4. We have Pollard or Debo ×3. We have Zay Flowers or Diggs ×3. Here's our add in the AFC. It's either Gus Edwards or Kincaid ×1. And then, San Fran wins, we get the Ayuk ×2. But if it's Dallas, we get the defense ×2. And then the AFC, we either get James Cooks ×2 or Justin Tucker ×2. And you can mess with that, flip with it, but you start to see the optionality of like, hey, you're not dead if this bracket doesn't go 100% right, especially if you get some other things early. You're still going to get 1 through 4x multiplier on both sides. Maybe it's not 100% the optimal, but again, this contest is, I think it's like 2,000 people. You don't have to hit the pure nuts to win it. And same thing in the FFPC. But yeah, you can see as you back away, okay, I need players to lose in these spots, and that's where you might go, Amari. I'm doing this quickly, so if I make a mistake, forgive me. But I'll go Amari and Nico ×1, and I know one of these guys, right, like is going to lose for sure. So I clear up a wide receiver spot. Maybe I do Kyron Williams. And I'd have to look at I might be making a bracket mistake too if it pays out chalk, but if I do Kyron Williams and Jahmyr Gibbs, same thing. I know I get one cleared spot for Pollard. And then my other running back spot is Kyron or Gibbs times 2. And I know Amari or Nico, persist times 2. And then I probably, still need to clear up 2 wide receiver spots. So I might do that again, I might actually need to try and pick 2 losers here. And that's where you start to see why you'd want winning teams in kicker and D, because over the long term, you can accumulate more points. Now, it's not going to break perfect. And the one thing I would do is, like, let's say I play, let's say I do Tyreek Hill then. I think Miami's going to lose. I'm planning on him losing. If Miami wins, I'm not taking Tyreek Hill off multiplier. I'm adjusting what I'm doing moving forward in round 2 then. Okay, so maybe I flip to a Miami Super Bowl or conference championship team if Tyreek Hill wins and I go to an upset. Or maybe I just ride it out and I still play Baltimore Buffalo based on how some things go early. But you start to see how this whole thing works out. So I hope that's helpful. I'm probably not going to, obviously not going to play this exact team as I'm giving it out. But this was the example of the chalkiest bracket possible, how you could make that work. Some other specific things with NFFC, I mentioned the Philly take at the end of the FFPC segment, but I think especially in NFFC, the Philly take is like really interesting, where you start with Jalen Hurts at quarterback. I don't think very many people are going to do it. I also think it's a situation too where if you just play one of Baltimore or Buffalo to get upset at some point, it's possible that like Hurts just outscores Josh Allen over a 2-week stretch and Philly doesn't even make it. And then you kind of add your Purdy or your Dak later if it's Dallas and San Francisco, that sort of thing. So that's something to keep in mind. But like, just to like fill this out as to what this, I'm sure I'm missing something obvious as to what this might work, is like, maybe you end up fading Kansas City, right? Like, we take, Jake Elliott from Philly. We take, KCDST. I'm sure I'm missing something here. And then we end up full fading in round 1. We end up full fading a couple of teams. We end up full fading Green Bay and Pittsburgh, 2 of the biggest underdogs. So, which isn't that crazy. So you end up full fading them, and you just have a couple of like small upsets, or not even upsets. You kind of want it to play out chalk, and then you end up with Philly and KC maybe winning, which is fine. You get their kicker and Dion times 2. You'd think that's horrible, but you then have the ability to start your other guys on the teams you think go further. So that's a really fun contest to think through, because there's absolutely levels to it. Few other notes there. Unlike FFPC, the whole contest locks at 4:30 on Saturday with that first game. You cannot make any changes. NFFC, that is not the case. You can make changes up to player start time. So if you're around all weekend and sweating this stuff, you could see where you might want to adjust your team based on some early information. Now, like I said, it's a long contest. There's multipliers to come. You don't want to overreact early. You could lose a lot of points in round 1 where, like, let's say you take Jahmyr Gibbs over Amon-Ra. Amon-Ra outscores Gibbs by 15 and Detroit wins. Gibbs just has to outscore Amon-Ra by 7 week 2 with the multiplier to get back at him, right? So like, you don't want to go overboard, but there are probably some little things where if you take a contrarian edge, one of the early games, maybe you flip to like a super chalk build for the rest of the weekend and then, figure it out week 2. I've also seen in the past where like a surprising low owned performer does really well week 1, and I've been afraid to add the player week 2. This has happened with McKinnon for KC in the past, Leonard Fournette for Tampa Bay in the past. And week 2, I'm like, I don't want to add that guy because someone's going to get him on ×2, ×3, ×4, and I'll be boxed out. I think you can still add that player. A lot of times that player does not get added as much as you think. And that player, if they're like 3 to 5% owned to start, there's a lot that can happen. There's going to be a lot of dead lineups out there. You don't have to be absolutely perfect. So you just want to be smart with how you're contrarian. And like, again, I have a tendency with the NFFC contest, the way with the 1 through 4X, to really want to be perfect, but you don't have to be absolutely perfect. Just make sure you check out the ownership percentages on site. They will provide them after all the games locked for the weekend. So check those out, check the standings, and make some constructive decisions from there. But I hope that helps as far as attacking these 2 contests. Appreciate everybody that tuned in. Again, like some of my favorite contests each year. If you are an established to run subscriber, feel free to tag me in Discord in the season long NFL channel. And I'm happy to answer any questions about playoff contests, particularly these 2 contests. I will be doing I think 3 entries in NFFC with Sam Brott and Sam Walzak, who are on our analytics team at Established to Run. So I'm looking forward to working on it with those guys. For FFPC, going to do a ton of teams with those guys, Dink, as well as the ship chasing guys. We're going to put together like a big portfolio. So, and then win a bunch of Sklansky bucks and lose actual bucks like we do each year. But if you're interested in kind of our planning for the FFPC stuff, check out the ship chasing channel tonight. I think it's 8:15, but I will double check the time on that. You'll be able to find it on my Twitter. But yeah, again, thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. Best of luck this playoffs.